The Horror in the Museum by H.P. Lovecraft for Hazel Heald. Part 4. Fool, spawn of Noth Yiddick and effluvium of Cathun, son of the dogs that howl in the maelstrom of Azathoth. You would have been sacred and immortal, and now you are betraying it and its priest. Beware, for it is hungry. It would have been Orabona, that damned treacherous dog, ready to turn against me and it. But I give you the first honor instead. Now you must both beware, for it is not gentle without its priest. Vengeance is at hand. Do you know you would have been immortal? Look at the furnace. There is a fire ready to light, and there is wax in the kettle. I would have done with you as I have done with other once living forms. Hey, you who have vowed all my effigies are waxen, would have become a waxen effigy yourself. The furnace was all ready, when it had had its fill, and you were like that dog I showed you. I would have made your flattened, punctured fragments immortal. Wax would have done it. Haven't you said I'm a great artist? Wax in every pore, wax over every square inch of you and ever after, the world would have looked at your mangled carcass and wondered how I ever imagined and made such a thing. Hey, and Orabona would have come next, and others after him. And thus would my waxen family have grown. Dog, do you still think I made all my effigies? Why not say preserved? You know by this time the strange places I've been to, and the strange things I've brought back. Coward. You could never face the dimensional shambler whose hide I put on to scare you. The mere sight of it alive, or even the full-fledged thought of it, would kill you instantly with fright. It waits hungry for the blood that is the life. Rogers, propped against the wall, swayed to and fro in his bonds. See here, Jones. If I let you go, will you let me go? It must be taken care of by its high priest. Orabona will be enough to keep it alive. And when he is finished, I will make his fragments immortal in wax for the world to see. It could have been you, but you have rejected the honor. I won't bother you again. Let me go, and I will share with you the power that it will bring me. Great is Rhan-Tegoth. Let me go, let me go. It is starving down there, beyond that door, and if it dies, the old ones can never come back. Hey, let me go. Jones merely shook his head, though the hideousness of the showman's imaginings revolted him. Rogers, now staring wildly at the padlocked plank door, thumped his head again and again against the brick wall and kicked with his tightly bound ankles. Jones was afraid he would injure himself, and advanced to bind him more firmly to some stationary object. Writhing, Rogers edged away from him, and set up a series of frenetic ululations whose utter, monstrous unhumanness was appalling, and whose sheer volume was almost incredible. It seemed impossible that any human throat could produce noises so loud and piercing, and Jones felt that if this continued there would be no need to telephone for aid. It could not be long before a constable would investigate, even granting that there were no listening neighbors in this deserted warehouse district. Ooza yay, howled the madman. Yakaha boa, Rhan-Tegoth Cthulhu fa tag ni, I, Rhan-Tegoth. The tautly trussed creature, who had started squirming his way across the littered floor, now reached the padlocked plank door and commenced knocking his head thunderously against it. Jones dreaded the task of binding him further, and wished he were not so exhausted from the previous struggle. This violent aftermath was getting hideously on his nerves, and he began to feel a return of the nameless qualms he had felt in the dark. Everything about Rogers and his museum was so hellishly morbid and suggestive of black vistas beyond life. It was loathsome to think of the waxen masterpiece of abnormal genius, which must at this very moment be lurking close at hand in the blackness beyond the heavy, padlocked door. And now something happened, which sent an additional chill down Jones's spine and caused every hair, even the tiny growth on the backs of his hands, to bristle with a vague fright beyond classification. Rogers had suddenly stopped screaming and beating his head against the stout plank door, and was straining up to a sitting posture, head cocked on one side as if listening intently for something. All at once a smile of devilish triumph overspread his face, and he began speaking intelligibly again, this time in a hoarse whisper, contrasting oddly with his former stentorian howling. Listen, fool, listen hard. It has heard me, and is coming. Can't you hear it splashing out of its tank down there at the end of the runway? I dug it deep, because there was nothing too good for it. It is amphibious, you know. You saw the gills in the picture. It came to the earth from Lead Grey Yugoth, where the cities are under the warm deep sea. It can't stand up in there too tall. Has to sit or crouch. Let me get my keys. We must let it out and kneel down before it. Then we will go out and find a dog or cat. Or perhaps a drunken man, to give it the nourishment it needs. It was not what the madman said, but the way he said it, that disorganized Jones so badly. The utter, insane confidence and sincerity in that crazed whisper were damnably contagious. Imagination, with such a stimulus, could find an active menace in the devilish wax figure that lurked unseen just beyond the heavy planking. Eyeing the door in unholy fascination, Jones noticed that it bore several distinct cracks, though no marks of violent treatment were visible on this side. He wondered how large a room or closet lay behind it, and how the waxen figure was arranged. The maniac's idea of a tank and runway was as clever as all his other imaginings. Then, in one terrible instant, Jones completely lost the power to draw a breath. The leather belt he had seized for Roger's further strapping fell from his limp hands, and a spasm of shivering convulsed him from head to foot. He might have known the place would drive him mad as it had driven Roger's. And now he was mad. He was mad, for he now harboured hallucinations more weird than any which had assailed him earlier that night. The madman was bidding him hear the splashing of a mythical monster in a tank beyond the door. And now, God help him, he did hear it. Rogers saw the spasm of horror reach Jones's face and transform it to a staring mask of fear. He cackled. "At last, fool, you believe. At last you know. You hear it, and it comes. Get me my keys, fool. We must do homage and serve it." But Jones was past paying attention to any human words, mad or sane. Phobic paralysis held him immobile and half-conscious, with wild images racing phantasmagorically through his helpless imagination. There was a splashing. There was a padding or shuffling as of great wet paws on a solid surface. Something was approaching. Into his nostrils from the cracks in that nightmare plank door poured a noisome animal stench like, and yet unlike that of the mammal cages at the zoological gardens in Regent's Park. He did not know now whether Rogers was talking or not. Everything real had faded away, and he was a statue obsessed with dreams and hallucinations, so unnatural that they became almost objective and remote from him. He thought he heard a sniffing or snorting from the unknown gulf beyond the door, and when a sudden baying, trumpeting noise assailed his ears, he could not feel sure that it came from the tightly bound maniac, whose image swam uncertainly in his shaken vision. The photograph of that accursed unseen wax thing persisted in floating through his consciousness. Such a thing had no right to exist, had it not driven him mad. Even as he reflected, a fresh evidence of madness beset him. Something, he thought, was fumbling with the latch of the heavy padlocked door. It was patting and pawing and pushing at the planks. There was a thudding on the stout wood, which grew louder and louder. The stench was horrible, and now the assault on that door from the inside was a malign, determined pounding like the strokes of a battering ram. There was an ominous cracking, a splintering, a welling fetor, a falling plank, a black paw ending in a crab-like claw. "Help! Help! God help me! Ah!" With intense effort, Jones is today able to recall a sudden bursting of his fear paralysis into the liberation of frenzied automatic flight. What he evidently did must have paralleled curiously the wild, plunging flights of maddest nightmares. For he seems to have leaped across the disordered crypt at almost a single bound, yanked open the outside door, which closed and locked itself after him with a clatter, sprung up the worn stone steps 3 at a time, and raced frantically and aimlessly out of that dank cobblestoned court and through the squalid streets of Southwark. Here the memory ends. Jones does not know how he got home, and there is no evidence of his having hired a cab. Probably he raced all the way by blind instinct. Over Waterloo Bridge, along the Strand and Charing Cross, and up Haymarket and Regent Street to his own neighbourhood. He still had on the queer melange of museum costumes when he grew conscious enough to call the doctor. A week later, the nerve specialists allowed him to leave his bed and walk in the open air, but he had not told the specialists much. Over his whole experience hung a pall of madness and nightmare. and he felt that silence was the only course. When he was up, he scanned intently all the papers which had accumulated since that hideous night, but found no reference to anything queer at the museum. How much, after all, had been reality? Where did reality end and morbid dream begin? Had his mind gone wholly to pieces in that dark exhibition chamber, and had the whole fight with Rogers been a phantasm of fever? It would help to put him on his feet if he could settle some of these maddening points. He must have seen that damnable photograph of the wax image called it, for no brain but Rogers could ever have conceived such a blasphemy. It was a fortnight before he dared to enter Southwark Street again. He went in the middle of the morning, when there was the greatest amount of sane, wholesome activity around the ancient crumbling shops and warehouses. The museum's sign was still there, and as he approached he saw that the place was open. The gateman nodded in a pleasant recognition as he summoned up the courage to enter, and in the vaulted chamber below, an attendant touched his cap cheerfully. Perhaps everything had been a dream. Would he dare to knock at the door of the workroom and look for Rogers? Then Orabona advanced to greet him. His dark, sleek face was a trifle sardonic, but Jones felt that he was not unfriendly. He spoke with a trace of accent. "Good morning, Mr. Jones. It is some time since we have seen you here. Did you wish Mr. Rogers? I'm sorry, but he is away. He had word of business in America and had to go." "Yes, it was very sudden. I am in charge now here and at the house. I try to maintain Mr. Rogers' high standard till he is back." The foreigner smiled, perhaps from affability alone. Jones scarcely knew how to reply, but managed to mumble out a few inquiries about the day after his last visit. Orabona seemed greatly amused by the questions, and took considerable care in framing his replies. "Oh yes, Mr. Jones, the 28th of last month. I remember it for many reasons. In the morning, before Mr. Rogers got here, you understand, I found the workroom in quite a mess. There was a great deal of cleaning up to do. There had been late work, you see. Important new specimen given its secondary baking process. I took complete charge when I came. It was a hard specimen to prepare. But of course Mr. Rogers has taught me a great deal. He is, as you know, a very great artist. When he came, he helped me complete the specimen. Helped very materially, I assure you. But he left soon without even greeting the men. As I tell you, he was called away suddenly. There were important chemical reactions involved. They made loud noises. In fact, some teamsters in the court outside fancy they heard several pistol shots. Very amusing idea. As for the new specimen, that matter is very unfortunate. It is a great masterpiece designed and made, you understand, by Mr. Rogers. He will see about it when he gets back." Again Orabona smiled. "The police, you know. We put it on display a week ago, and there were 2 or 3 faintings. One poor fellow had an epileptic fit in front of it. You see, it is a trifle stronger than the rest. Larger, for one thing. Of course, it was in the adult alcove. The next day, a couple of men from Scotland Yard looked it over and said it was too morbid to be shewn. Said we'd have to remove it. It was a tremendous shame. Such a masterpiece of art. But I didn't feel justified in appealing to the courts in Mr. Rogers' absence. He would not like so much publicity with the police now, but when he gets back. For some reason or other, Jones felt a mounting tide of uneasiness and repulsion. But Orabona was continuing. "You are a connoisseur, Mr. Jones. I am sure I violate no law in offering you a private view. It may be subject, of course, to Mr. Rogers' wishes that we shall destroy the specimen some day. But that would be a crime." Jones had a powerful impulse to refuse the sight and flee precipitately, but Orabona was leading him forward by the arm with an artist's enthusiasm. The adult alcove, crowded with nameless horrors, held no visitors. In the farther corner a large niche had been curtained off, and to this the smiling assistant advanced. "You must know, Mr. Jones, that the title of this specimen is The Sacrifice to Rhan-Tegoth." Jones started violently, but Orabona appeared not to notice. The shapeless, colossal god is a feature in certain obscure legends which Mr. Rogers has studied. All nonsense, of course, as you've so often assured Mr. Rogers. It is supposed to have come from outer space and to have lived in the Arctic 3 million years ago. It treated its sacrifices rather peculiarly and horribly, as you shall see. Mr. Rogers had made it fiendishly lifelike, even to the face of the victim. Now trembling violently, Jones clung to the brass railing in front of the curtained niche. He almost reached out to stop Orabona when he saw the curtain beginning to swing aside, but some conflicting impulse held him back. The foreigner smiled triumphantly. "Behold!" Jones reeled in spite of his grip on the railing. "God! Great God!" Fully 10 feet high despite a shambling, crouching attitude, expressive of infinite cosmic malignancy, a monstrosity of unbelievable horror was shewn, starting forward from a cyclopean ivory throne covered with grotesque carvings. In the central pair of its 6 legs, it bore a crushed, flattened, distorted, bloodless thing, riddled with a million punctures, and in places seared as with some pungent acid. Only the mangled head of the victim, lolling upside down at one side, revealed that it represented something once human. The monster itself needed no title, for one who had seen a certain hellish photograph. That damnable print had been all too faithful. Yet it could not carry the full horror which lay in the gigantic actuality. The globular torso, the bubble-like suggestion of a head, the 3 fishy eyes, the foot-long proboscis, the bulging gills, the monstrous capillation of asp-like suckers, the 6 sinuous limbs with their black paws and crab-like claws. God, the familiarity of that black paw ending in a crab-like claw. Orabona's smile was utterly damnable. Jones choked and stared at the hideous exhibit with a mounting fascination which perplexed and disturbed him. What half-revealed horror was holding and forcing him to look longer and search out details? This had driven Rogers mad. Rogers, supreme artist, said they weren't artificial. Then he localized the thing that held him. It was the crushed waxen victim's lolling head and something that it implied. This head was not entirely devoid of a face, and that face was familiar. It was like the mad face of poor Rogers. Jones peered closer, hardly knowing why he was driven to do so. Wasn't it natural for a mad egotist to mould his own features into his masterpiece? Was there anything more that subconscious vision had seized on and suppressed in sheer terror? The wax of the mangled face had been handled with boundless dexterity. Those punctures, how perfectly they reproduced the myriad wounds somehow inflicted on that poor dog. But there was something more. On the left cheek, one could trace an irregularity, which seemed outside the general scheme. As if the sculptor had sought to cover up a defect of his first modelling. The more Jones looked at it, the more mysteriously it horrified him. And then suddenly he remembered a circumstance which brought his horror to a head. That night of hideousness, the tussle, the bound madman, and the long, deep scratch down the left cheek of the actual living Rogers. Jones, releasing his desperate clutch on the railing, sank in a total faint. Orabona continued to smile.